In the winter of 1952, the city of Bridgeport, Connecticut was a place of iron and fog, a typical industrial town where people lived quiet, predictable lives against a backdrop of gray factories and cold Atlantic winds. But inside a small, cramped apartment on the third floor of a weathered building, one man was drifting further away from the ordinary world every single day. Albert K. Bender was a man of extraordinary discipline and a haunting curiosity that set him apart from the neighbors who walked the snowy streets below. He was a brilliant researcher, a man who possessed a mind capable of seeing hidden connections where others saw only chaos or coincidence. For years, he had been consumed by a singular, intense motivation that governed his every waking hour. He was determined to uncover the ultimate truth behind the unidentified flying objects that were increasingly appearing in the skies above the United States and across the entire globe. Bender was not content to simply read newspaper reports or listen to local rumors at the neighborhood diner. He wanted raw data, and he wanted it directly from the source. To achieve this, he established the International Flying Saucer Bureau, an organization that he managed entirely by himself from his modest living quarters. He called it the IFSB, and within months, his small apartment became the secret, beating heart of a global intelligence network. Letters arrived by the dozen every single morning, carrying exotic postmarks from London, Rio de Janeiro, and Tokyo. High-level secrets and confidential reports from military defectors, commercial pilots, and terrified civilians began pouring into his makeshift office. Bender sat for hours at his heavy wooden desk, surrounded by growing stacks of paper and blurry black and white photographs of metallic discs hovering over lonely forests. He meticulously filed every piece of evidence, cataloging the impossible with the precision of a master watchmaker. His dedication was total, bordering on the religious. He lived for the mail, for the long-distance phone calls, and for the moments of quiet realization when a new report from a distant country confirmed an old theory he had whispered only to himself. By the middle of 1952, the sheer volume of information began to coalesce into something terrifyingly clear. Bender had uncovered a shocking, recurring pattern among global sightings that no one else in the public sphere had yet identified. It was a discovery that felt like a bolt of electricity hitting his mind in the dead of night. He found that these celestial visitors were not just wandering the skies at random. They were following a specific, calculated logic that pointed toward a purpose far more complex than simple exploration. He believed he had finally solved the greatest mystery in human history, piercing the veil that had kept humanity in the dark for centuries. The excitement he felt was tempered by a sudden, chilling sense of responsibility. He began to prepare a final, comprehensive report for his publication, Space Review, convinced that once this information was released to the public, the course of human history would be altered forever. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a great cliff, ready to leap into a new reality. However, as Bender moved closer to revealing his findings, the atmosphere around him began to sour in a way that he could not explain. The air in his apartment grew heavy and stale, and a sense of creeping dread settled into his bones like a deep, persistent fever. It started with a feeling of being watched, a prickly sensation on the back of his neck whenever he walked near his window to close the curtains. When he finally gathered the courage to look out onto the street, he saw it for the first time. A strange, dark sedan. It was an immaculate vehicle that seemed completely out of place in the working-class neighborhood, its black paint so deep and lustrous that it looked like a void in the middle of the street. It sat there for hours on end, its engine silent and its headlights dark, its occupants invisible behind windows that were tinted to a total, impenetrable blackness. When he tried to call his associates to discuss the final details of his research, weird, mechanical clicking sounds began to echo on his phone lines. The rhythmic tapping made it impossible to speak freely, and sometimes he could hear a faint, hollow breathing on the other end of the line. Bender felt a growing sense of psychological isolation, as if an invisible wall were being built between him and the rest of the world. He was no longer just a researcher looking into the shadows. The shadows were now looking back at him. The climax of this mounting terror occurred on a late evening when Bender was alone in his room, the only light coming from a small lamp on his desk. The world outside was silent, but inside, the temperature suddenly plummeted far below freezing. It was not the gradual chill of a Connecticut night, but an unnatural, piercing cold that seemed to suck the very life out of the room. A thick, suffocating smell of sulfur filled the space, a scent so sharp and acrid that it made his lungs burn and his eyes water. Without a sound or the opening of a door, 3 figures materialized in the center of the room. They were dressed in immaculate coal-black suits that seemed to absorb what little light remained. Their faces were unnaturally pale, like polished bone, and their eyes glowed with a faint, hypnotic crimson light that held Bender in a paralyzed grip. They did not speak aloud. Instead, their voices entered his mind directly, a telepathic force that felt like cold steel sliding against his brain. They delivered a bone-chilling ultimatum, a warning that shook the very foundations of his soul and left him trembling in a state of absolute, wordless terror. His discovery was no longer a triumph. It was a death sentence. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Bender remained in that frozen state long after the figures had vanished, the smell of sulfur lingering in the curtains like a ghost. He looked at the stacks of research that had been his life's work, and for the first time, he felt a wave of pure, unadulterated regret. The truth he had sought so desperately was now a weight that threatened to crush him, and the men in the black suits had made it clear that the price of silence was his only hope for survival. He realized that he had stepped into a world that did not belong to men, and the gate was now locked behind him. The morning after the visitation, Albert K. Bender was a changed man. The fire that had once burned in his eyes, fueled by a relentless desire for discovery, had been replaced by a hollow, flickering fear. He did not wait for the mailman with his usual anticipation. He did not rush to the telephone when it rang. Instead, he took the steps that would send shockwaves through the global community of researchers he had helped build. Without a single word of explanation to his staff or his subscribers, Albert shut down the International Flying Saucer Bureau. This was not a gradual phasing out of operations or a polite retirement. It was a violent, sudden severing of ties. Thousands of members across the world, people who had looked to him as a pioneer and a fearless leader, received a short, cryptic notice in the final issue of his publication. The research was over. The Bureau was finished. His closest allies, men who had shared their most intimate secrets and theories with him for years, found themselves blocked by a wall of absolute silence. They called his home in Bridgeport repeatedly, but the line remained dead or went unanswered. They knocked on his door, but the curtains remained drawn, and the house felt as cold and lifeless as a tomb. To those who had worked by his side, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. They had been on the verge of a breakthrough, or so they thought, and their leader had seemingly surrendered to the darkness without a single word of protest. The confusion in the community quickly turned into resentment, and then into a lingering, uneasy suspicion. Some whispered that Bender had been bought off by the government, while others feared he had been replaced by something that only looked like him. They could not understand that Bender was not acting out of malice, but out of a paralyzing, soul-crushing terror that left no room for loyalty to anyone else. However, as the months turned into years, it became clear that the case of Albert K. Bender was not an isolated incident of a man losing his mind. A pattern began to emerge from the shadows of the 1950s, suggesting a much larger and more coordinated effort. The men in black were not just a hallucination born of one man's overactive imagination in Connecticut. They were a systemic, shadowy entity that functioned like a surgical tool, designed to remove anyone who reached too far into the forbidden archives of the unknown. Across the United States, and eventually across the oceans, others began to whisper about similar visitations. It was not just about the sightings of strange lights in the sky, but about the specific, chilling aftermath that followed those who tried to collect physical evidence. These entities seemed to track the flow of information like a predator tracks a scent through a forest. They were the cleaners, the silent agents of a status quo that refused to be disturbed by the truth. They possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to know exactly who held the most dangerous pieces of the puzzle at any given moment. In July of 1961, the shadow fell upon another man named Robert Richardson. He was a typical resident of Toledo, Ohio, a man who had never sought the spotlight or cared much for legends of the unexplained. One night, while he was driving through the quiet, darkened streets of his neighborhood, the mundane reality of his life was shattered. As he rounded a sharp bend, his headlights caught something impossible. A metallic disc-shaped object, glowing with a soft and pulsing light, was obstructing the road directly ahead of him. Richardson slammed on his brakes, the tires screaming against the asphalt, but he could not stop in time. The collision was strange and muffled, as if he had struck a mass of heavy liquid rather than solid steel. The impact jerked his car to a halt, but when he scrambled out of the driver's seat, the object was gone. It had vanished into the night sky without a sound. Richardson stood in the middle of the road, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at the spot where the impact had occurred. On the dark asphalt, he found a small, jagged fragment of metal that had been sheared off during the collision. It was heavy for its size and possessed a texture unlike anything he had ever encountered in his life. It was smooth yet strangely warm to the touch, as if it were still vibrating with a hidden energy. He took the fragment home and placed it in a secure location, believing he had finally found the physical proof that had eluded researchers for decades. He did not tell the newspapers, and he did not call the police immediately. He wanted to understand what he had found before the rest of the world descended upon him. 2 weeks later, the air in Richardson's home shifted in a way that felt eerily familiar to the accounts whispered by men like Bender. It was the same sudden drop in temperature, the same sense of being compressed by an invisible heavy force. There was a knock at his front door, sharp and perfectly rhythmic. Standing on his porch were 2 men who looked as though they had been cut from the same dark cloth as the figures who had visited Bridgeport years earlier. They wore immaculate black suits, their ties perfectly knotted and their black hats cast deep, unnatural shadows over their pale and expressionless faces. They did not ask for permission to enter. They simply walked past Richardson, their movements stiff and mechanical, like dolls being manipulated by invisible strings from above. The emotional tension in the room became almost physical, a weight that made it difficult for Richardson to draw a full breath. The men did not blink. They did not breathe in a way that seemed human. They looked at Richardson with eyes that felt like cold glass, scanning the very depths of his memory and his conscience. One of the men spoke in a voice that was flat, metallic, and entirely devoid of any human inflection. He did not ask how Richardson had found the metal or what he intended to do with it. He simply demanded the fragment, stating that the object did not belong to him and must be returned to its rightful owners immediately. Richardson, feeling a sudden and unexpected surge of defiance despite his growing terror, decided to lie. He told the men that he had already turned the fragment over to the authorities for scientific testing, and that it was no longer in his possession. The men did not react with anger or frustration. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. The lead figure leaned in closer, the air around him smelling faintly of ozone and old dust. He gave a dark, whispered warning, suggesting that some secrets are better left lost in the dark and that his safety depended on his total cooperation. Without another word, they turned and walked out of the house, disappearing into the night as if they had never existed at all. Shaken and trembling, Richardson ran to his secure vault, a place where no one else had a key and no one else could have entered without force. He threw open the heavy metal door to check on the fragment, desperate to prove to himself that he still held the power. His heart stopped as he looked inside. The velvet-lined box was sitting exactly where he had left it, but it was empty. The metal fragment was gone, vanished from a locked safe in a house that had been under his constant watch. It was a terrifying and undeniable demonstration of power. It was a sign that for the men in black, physical barriers like walls, locks, and vaults were nothing more than mere suggestions. They did not just want the truth. They owned the truth, and they could reach into the most private corners of a man's life to take it back whenever they pleased. Richardson realized then that he was no longer the owner of a discovery. He was a marked man, and the eyes that had watched Bender were now firmly fixed on him. The years that followed the abrupt and silent closure of the International Flying Saucer Bureau were defined by a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of secrecy. Albert K. Bender lived like a ghost within the walls of his own home in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a man whose once vibrant and relentless curiosity had been replaced by a jagged, ever-present paranoia. Every footstep on the sidewalk outside his window sounded like a threat, and every low-frequency hum of a passing engine made his heart race with the memory of that sulphurous chill. The psychological toll of his encounter was immense and visible to anyone who caught a rare glimpse of him. He watched his friendships wither and his professional life crumble, as his former colleagues in the research community looked at him with a mixture of deep pity and growing resentment. They could not understand how a man who claimed to be so close to the ultimate truth could simply walk away and lock the door behind him without a single word of explanation. For Bender, the world had become a smaller and much darker place, where the simple act of looking up at the stars felt like a dangerous invitation for disaster. He was a prisoner of a secret that he was strictly forbidden to share, and the weight of that silence began to erode his spirit from the inside out. He lived in a state of constant, low-level dread, always checking the locks on his doors and windows, and feeling the invisible weight of eyes following him through the thin curtains of his apartment. This was the long, slow victory of the men in black. They did not need to take his life to destroy him. They simply had to take away his sense of safety and his purpose. He moved through the 1950s as a shadow, a warning to others that some truths were far too heavy for a single human mind to carry without breaking under the pressure. However, as the calendar turned to 1962, the fear that had once paralyzed Bender began to transform into a desperate and quiet need for catharsis. He realized that living in absolute forced compliance was its own kind of death, and he could no longer bear the thought of his story dying with him in that dusty apartment. After nearly a decade of hiding in the shadows, Bender made the monumental decision to make one final stand against the forces that had silenced him. He began to compile his terrifying experiences and his forbidden knowledge into a manuscript titled Flying Saucers and the Three Men. This was not merely an act of reporting or scientific inquiry. It was a bid for personal redemption and a way to finally reclaim the voice that had been stolen from him in that cold, terrifying room in Bridgeport so many years before. The process of writing was an exercise in pure, raw suspense. Bender knew the risks he was taking with every word he typed onto the page. He knew that the figures in the immaculate black suits were likely watching his every movement, perhaps even reading the words over his shoulder as they manifested in the corners of his room. He worked in a feverish state, driven by the belief that if he could just get the story out into the world, the power they held over him might finally begin to dissolve. He described the telepathic commands, the glowing eyes, and the impossible technology he had glimpsed, all while bracing himself for the moment the door would burst open and the three figures would return to finish what they had started. As the publication date for his book approached, the tension in his life reached a fever pitch. He lived in a state of constant electric expectation, fully prepared for his manuscript to vanish from his desk, just as the mysterious metallic fragment had vanished from the secure vault of Robert Richardson. The air in his apartment seemed to grow thick and heavy once more, vibrating with that familiar metallic hum that signaled their arrival. He felt like a lone soldier standing in the middle of a vast and empty battlefield, waiting for an invisible and incomprehensible enemy to strike the final blow. This was the ultimate climax of his decade-long struggle, a battle of wills between a single, fragile human being and a powerful cosmic authority that operated far beyond the reach of human law or logic. When the book was finally released to the public in 1962, the reaction was not at all what the research community had anticipated. Instead of providing a clear and scientific breakdown of the unidentified flying object phenomenon, the text was a strange, surreal, and deeply unsettling descent into the occult. It spoke of otherworldly dimensions, strange rituals, and entities that felt more like ancient demons than travelers from another planet. More unsettling than the bizarre content of the book was the change that had come over Bender himself. Although he had successfully published his story, he did not emerge from the experience as a triumphant hero who had defeated his oppressors. Instead, he seemed even more withdrawn and compliant than he had been during his years of silence. It was as if the act of publishing the book had been permitted or even orchestrated by the men in black themselves, perhaps because the information was so strange and confusing that it would only serve to further obscure the truth. The fiery passion that had once driven Albert K. Bender to found the International Flying Saucer Bureau was gone, replaced by a permanent and quiet acceptance of his role as a mere spectator in a universe he no longer wished to understand. The Men in Black, having effectively neutralized a primary threat and turned a brilliant researcher into a source of confusion, seemed to dissolve back into the fabric of history. They returned to the shadows, leaving behind a legacy of broken lives and unanswered questions that would haunt the world for decades to come. The story of Albert K. Bender and the many witnesses like Robert Richardson serves as a chilling testament to the steep price of curiosity. Even today, the question remains of who these figures truly are. Are they government operatives, the ultimate enforcers of a deep state agenda meant to protect the public from a reality it is not prepared to handle? Or are they extraterrestrial agents sent to erase the physical and mental footprints of visitors from beyond our world? There is also the darker, more psychological possibility that they are a manifestation of our own collective human dread, a personification of the fear we feel when we realize how small we truly are in the vastness of the cosmos. Whatever the truth may be, the legend of the Men in Black remains a haunting reminder that there are boundaries we were never meant to cross. They are the shadows at the edge of the light, the cold breath on the back of your neck when you look too closely into the darkness. If you ever find yourself on the verge of a discovery that could change the world, remember the silence that fell over the city of Bridgeport. Some secrets are guarded by forces that do not value human life or human progress, and the cost of the ultimate truth may be more than any one person can ever afford to pay. The Men in Black are still out there, waiting in the silence, watching those who dare to look up and ask the questions that were meant to remain unasked.